After losing their mother, the widowed Count's 3 children hid themselves away, lost to silence and sorrow for 3 long years, until a quiet, courageous young Nanny arrived and opened a door no one else dared touch. Her gentle strength shattered darkness, reawakening hope in their wounded hearts and shaking the very foundations of a house ruled by grief. Yet as healing blossomed, suspicion and jealousy threatened to tear her away, forcing the Count to choose between the whispers of his household and the powerful truth of the woman who brought his family back into the light. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The carriage wheels groaned over the gravel with a sound like bones grinding against stone. Clara Hartwell leaned slightly forward on the cracked leather seat, gloved hands clasped over her small valise, her back rigid as the estate came into view beyond the tangled line of bare trees. Greystone Hall rose from the mist, like the shell of something ancient, impossibly still, dark-eyed, and indifferent to the world it overlooked. Ivy clung to its walls in long, blackened veins. Its towers stood like sentinels, windows shuttered and soot-streaked. The sky above was a low curtain of grey, heavy with the promise of rain, though none had yet fallen. As the carriage drew to a halt in the circular drive, a blast of wind carried the scent of damp earth, moss, and something older. Wood smoke, faint and fading. The driver stepped down without a word and opened the door. Clara descended slowly, the hem of her ash-colored traveling dress brushing the cold stone underfoot. Her boots made no sound. Only the low caw of a rook overhead broke the silence, and even that was quickly swallowed by the stillness of the moorland air. A butler in dark livery emerged from beneath the great arched entrance. Behind him, a footman carried no expression at all. Neither bowed, neither welcomed her. They stood like extensions of the building itself, worn smooth by repetition, uninterested in exception. "Mrs. Clara Hartwell?" the butler asked, his voice as dry as parchment. "Yes," she answered, and something in her tone, not timid, but soft and steady, made him hesitate for just a second before gesturing her inside. The entrance hall was immense and cold, its stone floor glistening faintly with moisture brought in by the wind. High above, a chandelier hung unlit. The ceiling, ribbed with ancient beams, echoed the sound of her steps as she crossed the threshold. The air smelled of polish and ashes. No fire burned in the hearth. No lamps were lit. It felt like entering a cathedral abandoned to silence. She was led down a wide corridor to a smaller vestibule, where a woman waited, spine straight as a rod and mouth pinched into a permanent line of judgment. Her gown was dark wool with severe pleats, a brass chatelaine clipped to her waist and keys that jingled when she moved. "I am Lady Rowanhurst," she said without greeting, "housekeeper of Greystone Hall. I presume you were told this position is temporary." Clara inclined her head. "Yes." Lady Rowanhurst examined her as if assessing the strength of a beam. "Then we are clear. You are here because no one else will come. We've had 4, no 5 nurses in the last year alone. All of them left by morning, or were dismissed before they could finish supper." She gestured toward the corridor with a sharp nod. Clara followed her past shuttered windows and portraits thick with dust. Each step deepened the hush of the place. They ascended a narrow staircase and turned down another corridor, this one more modest, its rugs worn thinner, its plaster walls marked by time. "You will find the nursery in the north wing, but you will not go there unless instructed. The wing is closed. The children," she hesitated just slightly, "are not to be disturbed." Clara said nothing. The housekeeper's tone was not one that welcomed questions. "This will be your room," Lady Rowanhurst continued, opening a door onto a small chamber overlooking the east courtyard. The bed was narrow but clean. A washstand stood beside a faded armchair. The hearth was cold. A single candle burned on the mantel. "You may ring if you need assistance. Meals are taken downstairs, but as staff you are not expected at the main table. The Count prefers privacy." And with that, she departed, her steps as rigid as her posture, leaving Clara alone with her silence and the slow ticking of a wall clock that seemed louder than the wind outside. Clara unpacked what little she had: 2-day dresses, a spare pair of gloves, a well-used comb, and a worn book of scripture she never read but always carried. As she set them in the drawer, she paused at the small portrait tucked inside the lining of her valise, a miniature of a man with warm eyes and a slight smile. She touched it once before sliding it out of sight again. The afternoon passed in the still hush of the house. Clara roamed the lower halls with quiet steps, observing more than she asked. The servants moved like shadows, efficient, wordless, and alert. No one lingered. No one raised their voice. A footman dropped a tray and flinched before picking it up, his face pale. She passed a parlor where 2 maids whispered behind a velvet curtain. One glanced at Clara and quickly looked away. What she did not hear was laughter, no childish squeals, no footsteps racing across floors. The very air seemed to resist such sounds. When she asked the kitchen maid, a girl no older than 17 with freckles and perpetually chapped lips, where the children played, she received only a quick glance. "They don't," the girl muttered, eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Have they been ill?" "They've not come down since the Countess passed. That was 3 years ago this autumn." She hesitated. "We leave their food outside the nursery. No one goes in. No one stays long." Clara frowned. "And the nurses?" "Gone by morning, like I said. One didn't last an hour." She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's not just grief. There's something wrong up there. The walls don't like strangers." Before Clara could ask what that meant, the girl was gone. That evening she was not summoned to the dining hall. Her meal, a modest plate of bread, cheese and cold beef, was brought to her quarters by a silent footman who offered no eye contact. She sat alone in her chair, the fire still unlit, the chill creeping into her bones. Somewhere in the distance, a door groaned open. Another slammed shut. Edward Wexley did not appear. Outside, the wind picked up. It whistled through the stone corners of the building, rattling the shutters and tapping branches against the leaded windows. Clara sat upright in bed, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her fingers cold even beneath the covers. The candle had long since gone out. She stared into the dark and waited for sleep that would not come. Then came the sound, not loud, but unmistakable. A low creak, a thud, and something softer, like a whisper muffled by fabric. It came from above her, from the north wing. Clara sat up. She told herself not to move, told herself it was none of her business, that she had been warned. But the silence after that sound was worse than the sound itself. She rose, padded across the rug, and slipped her feet into her boots. Her shawl hung from the end of the bed, and she wrapped it around her shoulders, hands trembling only slightly. The corridor outside her door was colder than her room. The sconces were unlit. She moved quickly and without hesitation, guided by memory. A small, barely visible servant staircase curled upward behind the tapestry at the end of the hall. She climbed it slowly, the narrow wood steps groaning beneath her weight. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time she reached the upper floor, her breath showed in the darkness like smoke. The north wing was darker than the rest of the house. The wallpaper had curled from the seams. The windows were shuttered tight, and the sconces held only stubs of unused wax. A single long corridor stretched out before her, ending in a large wooden door with iron hinges. The nursery. She approached. The silence pressed harder here. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her footsteps were soundless on the worn carpet. Her fingers closed around the doorknob, expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The latch gave way with a faint click, and the door eased back a fraction of an inch. Just enough to see that it had been left open. She hesitated, heart hammering. Then she pushed gently. The floor creaked beneath her foot, and something moved in the darkness beyond. The door creaked as Clara pushed it open, its hinges groaning in protest, as if the air itself resisted being disturbed. A wave of cold met her first, heavy with the scent of old firewood and something dry and lifeless. Dust, paper, time. She stepped inside slowly, instinctively holding her breath. The air was thick, unmoved for what felt like years, pressing against her skin like damp cloth. It was almost completely dark. The heavy velvet drapes had been pulled tight across the windows, blocking out even the faint silver of moonlight. Her eyes adjusted gradually, revealing the outlines of forgotten furniture. The curve of a rocking chair with a blanket draped half over its back, a narrow toy chest with a broken latch, shelves bowed with the weight of books and objects she could not yet see. A rug, once bright, now dulled to the color of ash, stretched across the center of the floor. The room felt suspended in time, like no one had entered since the world ended 3 years ago. Then came the sound, soft, almost imperceptible. Breathing. Not one breath, but several. Close. She turned her head slowly, eyes sweeping the room, until they found the far corner, where the shadows deepened beneath the arched window seat. There they were. 3 children, seated close together on a narrow bed beneath the covered window, huddled not from cold but from something deeper. They were as still as portraits. Their faces, pale, gaunt, expressionless, stared at her without blinking. One held a doll to her chest, her fingers tight around its waist. The middle child's face was pressed against the shoulder of the oldest. The eldest, a boy, sat half-turned toward the others, watchful, protective, defiant. Clara did not speak. She did not ask their names. She didn't move any closer. Instead, she crossed the room in deliberate silence and sat down on the floor just far enough to give them space, just near enough to share the stillness. Her back touched the wall. She folded her hands in her lap and breathed and waited. The clock on the mantel, its face barely visible in the gloom, did not tick. No wind rattled the shutters. The silence wasn't simply absence. It was something alive, watchful, breathing alongside them. The kind of silence that fills the void grief leaves behind, and which no voice has dared to interrupt for far too long. The youngest, the one with the doll, stared at Clara with wide eyes that never blinked. Her face was rounder than the others, and Clara guessed she must be the youngest. Lottie, perhaps. The boy, Thomas, if she recalled the names correctly, watched her with a fixed gaze, not angry, not frightened, but calculating, protective. The middle child, Anna, barely lifted her head. The longer she stayed, the more Clara noticed the tiny movements, a slight shift in posture, a breath caught, the doll's ribbon slowly unraveling between small fingers. She made no comment, asked no questions. Minutes passed, then an hour. The chill began to settle in her spine, but she didn't shift her position. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was as quiet as a thought. "I'm not here to make you speak," she said, "or to make you smile. I'm only here to be with you." They didn't respond, but neither did they look away. She stayed a while longer, until her feet went numb and her fingers stiffened in the cold. Still, she did not rush. When she rose, it was carefully, quietly, her hand braced on the wall for balance. She did not turn her back until she was at the door. They did not follow. But Lottie's head turned slightly as Clara reached the hallway, her eyes tracking her departure, as if uncertain whether the woman they had just seen was real, or merely another shadow sent to vanish by morning. Clara returned to her room in the east wing with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her limbs trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of something larger, more terrible, knowing. The door to her chamber stood ajar. She paused on the threshold, surprised. Lady Rowanhurst stood just inside. Her arms were crossed over her bodice, the ring of keys at her waist catching the lamplight. The expression on her face was one of barely concealed disapproval, her mouth pursed as if she had tasted something sour. "I was informed that you entered the north wing," she said, her voice low and clipped. Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She said nothing. "You were told it was forbidden. That wing has been closed for a reason. You are not here to interfere in matters that do not concern you." I'm here for the children, Clara answered quietly. They are my concern. Lady Rowanhurst drew herself taller, though she was already nearly a head above Clara. You were brought here because no one else would come. The agency refused to send anyone after the last 2 departures. You are here under that condition. No training, no references, and I fear no understanding of what Greystone requires. Clara looked at her directly, her gaze steady. Then why haven't you sent me away? The housekeeper's mouth pressed more tightly shut. After a pause, she said, Because we've run out of options. She stepped past Clara to the door. I won't pretend this house isn't unique, but I will remind you. Count Wexley does not tolerate disobedience. Do not assume he will be forgiving. Clara did not answer. The door closed behind Lady Rowanhurst with a soft but final sound. The wind scraped at the window panes again. Clara sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the candle flickering on the mantel, the flame stretching thin in the drafty room. Her heart beat slowly now, no longer thudding like it had on the stairs. The image of the 3 children sat in her mind like a painting she could not put away. The tension in Thomas's shoulders. Anna's turned face. Lottie's doll clutched as if it were the only thing keeping her rooted to the world. She wondered who had last touched them with tenderness, or if anyone had tried. The hours crept by. Midnight passed. Her eyes remained open, then soft, delicate. A sound just beyond the door. A knock. Not firm, not adult. A series of timid taps, barely enough to carry. Clara stood, the hem of her nightgown brushing her ankles. Her shawl once again clutched around her like armor. She crossed the room barefoot. The boards beneath her feet were cold, but her pulse warmed her blood. She opened the door slowly. There was no one standing there, just the hush of the corridor. Shadows where the candlelight couldn't reach. The distant creak of the house breathing around her. Then she looked down. A folded piece of paper had been placed at her door, pale and creased, no larger than her palm. She bent to pick it up. The handwriting was uneven, awkward, child-sized. It spelled only one word: stay. The gray hush of early morning clung to Greystone Hall like a second skin. Mist laced through the courtyard and drifted over the hedges, and the trees beyond stood motionless beneath a pale sky that had not yet committed to day. In her small room on the east side of the house, Clara Hartwell moved with quiet purpose, the soft rustle of skirts and the clink of porcelain, the only sounds in the chilled silence. She filled a tray with care, 3 warm rolls wrapped in linen, a pot of black tea, slices of apple arranged in a fan, and a bit of soft cheese. She hesitated over the preserves before selecting a small pot of plum jam. The tray was modest but thoughtful, a gesture made not out of obligation but instinct. Her boots were soundless against the corridor floor as she crossed through the still sleeping house. The sconces remained unlit. The hush of early light filtered faintly through the tall, narrow windows along the main passage, casting watery reflections onto the walls. She didn't hesitate when she reached the hidden stairwell, nor when her hand touched the cold brass of the doorknob at the entrance to the north wing. This time, she did not knock. The door opened without protest. The air inside was still heavy with that same musty scent, old wood, cold stone, and the faded sweetness of something that had long gone untouched. Her breath puffed before her in the chill as she entered, the breakfast tray balanced steadily in her hands. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she crossed the floor. The children were in the same place as before, curled on the narrow bed beneath the draped window, silent and watchful. Their eyes tracked her, but they did not retreat, nor did they cry out. The smallest flinch, the slightest shift in posture, subtle signs of awareness, of presence, spoke more than words. Clara walked to the windows and with deliberate care pulled back one of the velvet curtains. Gray morning light flooded part of the room, cutting across the dust-laced air in long silver blades. The sudden light revealed more of the nursery's forgotten corners: a toppled wooden horse, a cracked teacup on a doll's table, books with their spines turned toward the wall. She set the tray down on a low table and sat beside it on the floor, folding her legs beneath her skirts. She didn't look directly at them. Instead, she poured the tea with measured calm and began to speak. Not loudly, not expectantly, but as if they had known one another a long time. "I once walked to Langmere village in the spring," she said, spreading jam onto a piece of bread. "It was a foolish thing to do in my best shoes, but the wildflowers were out. I couldn't help myself." There was no response, no movement. She went on. "There was a little robin that followed me nearly the whole way, hopping behind like he was listening. He stopped every few paces, as if to make sure I hadn't forgotten he was there. I named him Harold. He didn't seem to mind." She placed the bread on a small china plate and left it near the edge of the table. One of the apples followed. A cup of tea was poured but left untouched. The clouds that day looked like sheep. Not the dirty ones, mind you, but the ones in the advertisements, where they're fluffed and white and somehow smiling. I think Harold liked them too. She smiled faintly to herself, though the children did not speak. But from the corner of her eye, she saw a shift. The boy, Thomas, she was now certain, was watching her. His arms remained crossed, his back straight, but his eyes followed her movements, cautious and precise. The middle child, Anna, peeked at her briefly before ducking back behind the thin drape of her brother's sleeve. Lottie, the smallest, had moved imperceptibly closer to the table. Clara said nothing about it. She picked up her own cup, took a sip of the now cooling tea, and continued to speak as though to herself. Small things. The color of buttercups, the warmth of the soil in summer, the sound a fox makes when it thinks no one is listening. It was nearly an hour before Lottie reached for a piece of toast. She did it when Clara wasn't looking, or perhaps when she thought Clara wasn't. The movement was swift and careful, as though she'd snatched a secret. She held it in both hands and nibbled at one corner, her doll pressed tight beneath her arm. Clara didn't react. She only continued speaking in her calm, low voice, as though nothing at all had changed. Far below, in the depths of the house, Count Edward Wexley sat behind his writing desk in the study, a ledger open before him. The window to his left remained fogged with condensation from the cold outside, though he had left it slightly ajar to let in the scent of the rain-washed grounds. The fire behind him had gone to coals. He had been reviewing expenses for the estate, wheat orders, roof repairs, a broken cistern, but he'd read the same line 5 times without absorbing a word. The knock on the door was sharp and sudden. Lady Rowanhurst entered before being granted permission, her face drawn and tense. "She's gone to the nursery," she said without preamble. "This morning, with a tray. I saw her crossing through the lower corridor at dawn." Edward stood without a word. His face did not betray the reaction behind his eyes. He crossed the room, pulled on his coat, and left the study, his footsteps precise and measured, echoing along the corridors like a ticking clock. He climbed the main staircase slowly. His hands were clasped behind his back, his mouth a tight line. He passed through the east wing, then the servants' stairwell, and finally to the edge of the corridor that led to the north wing nursery. The door ahead stood ajar. He approached it. The silence within was not complete. There was a voice, soft, steady, and unfamiliar. Clara's. He caught only fragments. "And then I stepped into the stream like a fool, and the cold went straight to my knees." He reached the door, prepared to enter. Then he heard something that stopped him in place. A laugh. It was faint, brittle with disuse, barely more than a breath. But it was laughter, a child's laugh. He stood still, the sound lodged somewhere in his chest like a forgotten memory. For a long moment, he did nothing, did not speak, did not enter. His hand lowered from the doorframe. He turned and walked back down the hall. Later that day, a summons arrived in Clara's quarters. The note was brief, the ink careful. "The Count will see you in the library." She arrived just past midday. The library was vast and dimly lit, the curtains half drawn and the hearth empty. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books, most of them worn but lovingly kept. A long table stood in the center of the room. Edward Wexley stood behind it, hands braced on the edge, gaze turned toward the window. He did not ask her to sit. "You disobeyed instructions," he said without turning. "Yes," Clara replied. His voice was calm but distant. "The north wing was closed to you for a reason. I understand that. Then why go?" She paused only a moment. "Because the children are not misbehaving, they're grieving, and grief doesn't answer to doors or rules." He turned toward her, face unreadable. For several seconds he said nothing. She didn't avert her gaze. "They are not wild creatures," she continued, her voice quiet but steady. "They do not need discipline. They need someone who will not be afraid of their silence." Still he said nothing, only watched her with eyes that searched too deeply, too quickly. She waited for the reprimand, for dismissal, but it never came. He nodded once. A dismissal of a different kind. Clara turned and left the library without another word. He did not watch her go, but he lingered by the window long after the door had closed. That evening, the nursery was warmer. The drapes remained open, the dying light of dusk slanting across the rug in golden streaks. Clara returned with a book in her hands, well worn, with pages soft at the corners. She lit the small hearth with careful hands and sat on the floor as she had that morning. The children were already gathered, though they said nothing. She opened the book and began to read. Her voice was gentle, almost musical as she spun the tale of forests and talking animals, of a girl who wandered too far and found herself in a world where nothing was quite as it seemed. Lottie curled at her feet. Anna leaned slightly closer. Thomas sat still, but his attention was absolute. Then, as she turned the page, a voice broke the silence. It was rough and quiet, but clear. "Read that part again." The news moved through Greystone Hall like spilled ink on blotting paper. Quick, quiet, and impossible to contain. The children had spoken. Not one of them, but all three. It had been overheard by a passing maid, half a phrase from Thomas's mouth, followed by the soft echo of laughter that no one in the household had heard in years. By midday, every corridor buzzed with hushed murmurs, servants glancing over shoulders and pausing mid-task to speculate in voices barely above a breath. The scullery maid swore it was witchcraft. The footman from the stables declared it luck. The laundress, more generous, said perhaps the new nanny had charm, or madness. And at the heart of it all was Clara Hartwell, the quiet woman from nowhere, with no proper credentials and no clear reason for succeeding where others had failed. Lady Rowanhurst was not pleased. She appeared at Clara's door just after breakfast, the keys at her waist clinking with unusual insistence, her expression set with something sharper than reprimand. "You have disrupted the balance of this house," she said, standing stiffly just inside the threshold. "I warned you not to meddle. There were reasons the north wing was kept closed." Clara, standing by the hearth with a book still in her hand, looked at her calmly. "There were children in that wing." "That was reason enough." Lady Rowanhurst's mouth tightened. "You think kindness is all it takes? That this house will bend for you because you arrive with tea trays and fairy tales?" She shook her head once. "Greystone does not welcome change, and neither do the people within it." Clara didn't argue. She only inclined her head, and the housekeeper left with the same rigid precision that marked her every step. But Clara kept to her rhythm. Each morning she climbed the servant stair and entered the nursery without knocking. She opened the drapes to let in the gray light, letting it spill across the faded carpet and over the bookshelves still lined with dust. She brought a new story each day. Tales of far-off countries, of beasts who turned kind, and girls who refused to be silent. Some days she brought puzzles or chalk, others, a simple pack of cards, worn soft at the corners. Each evening, when she left the door open a little wider. The children no longer sat in silence. Anna began to move closer during the readings, sitting cross-legged beside Clara with her chin tucked into her hand. Sometimes she would lean lightly against Clara's arm, not with certainty, but with permission. Thomas began to ask questions, not many, and never about himself, but questions that showed his mind was listening, reaching outward instead of folding inward. Lottie followed Clara around the room with soft footsteps and insisted on brushing the edge of her sleeve with the hand of her frayed doll. "To see if you're real," she whispered once. Clara made no demands of them. She never asked about their mother. She never stopped them when tears came, as they sometimes did, sudden and unexplained, like small storms breaking without warning. Instead, she simply stayed. Her silence carried weight, not emptiness. And the children, who had lived too long in the stillness of grief, began to recognize her quiet for what it was: presence. Trust did not bloom all at once. It took root slowly, like something growing beneath cold earth. But it was there. Clara saw it in the way Anna reached for her hand when no one else was looking, in the way Thomas stayed close when she moved about the room, in the way Lottie, with her doll clutched to her chest, began humming broken nursery songs Clara did not know. Greystone did not change. The walls remained thick with silence. The staff continued their whispers. But in the nursery, something had begun to warm. That afternoon, Clara took her usual walk through the estate grounds, her skirts brushing damp grass as she followed the path around the lower gardens. The hedgerows rustled softly in the breeze, and the clouds hung low as they so often did in Westmoreland. She liked this time of day, the stillness, the solitude. It gave her space to breathe, to remember that she was part of something, but not bound by it. She was returning to the east wing when she heard footsteps behind her, not hurried, but deliberate. She turned at the curve of the path and saw a man approaching, his coat dark and tailored, his walking stick tapping lightly with each step. He was younger than she'd expected, though not by much. His hair was a pale gold, his expression polished and composed. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said smoothly as he reached her. "What a pleasure. I don't believe we've met." She offered a polite nod. "No, we haven't." "Julian Wexley," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "The Count's cousin. I reside in London mostly, but I'm often here on business, family matters and all that." He smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting easily. "I've heard of your success. I'm not sure I'd call it that." "Oh, but the children are talking now, aren't they?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Laughing even. It's been years and suddenly you arrive and presto, remarkable." Clara met his gaze. "It's not magic." "Of course not," he said lightly. "Still, the staff seem utterly enchanted. There's talk of miracles, if you can believe it." He took a step closer. "And yet, I imagine your position here must feel precarious. No training, no references, no family connection. It's easy to become dispensable in a place like this." "I'm not worried," Clara said, her tone cool. He smiled again, this time with an edge behind it. "Good. Confidence becomes you." Then he tipped his hat once more. "Do take care, Mrs. Hartwell." She gave a small curtsy and continued on her path, not turning back. But Julian did, and his eyes, no longer smiling, followed her with intent. That evening, Clara returned to the nursery as the last light faded from the windows. The sky was a dull silver, and the house had settled into its usual evening hush. She carried with her a small basket, apples, a storybook, and a spool of ribbon Anna had admired the day before. The nursery door, as always, stood slightly ajar. She touched the edge with her fingers and pushed it open, expecting to see the soft glow of the hearth, the scattered remains of the game they'd played that morning. Perhaps a dropped sock or a misplaced shoe. But the room was empty. The fire had gone out. The curtains fluttered faintly in a breeze that shouldn't have been there. She stepped inside, her heart thudding. The bed was unmade. The tray from breakfast still sat near the hearth, untouched. A doll lay face down on the rug. And the window, tall, narrow, and usually latched, stood wide open, The heavy velvet curtains swept aside. Cold air poured into the room, stirring the dust and making the candlelight on the hallway wall flicker behind her. The children were gone. The wind blew softly through the open nursery window, stirring the curtains in slow, languid waves. Clara stared at the empty bed, the dropped doll, the way the air had turned colder, as though the room itself had exhaled. Her breath caught. She stepped back out into the hallway, her voice catching in her throat. "Thomas," she called, then louder. "Anna, Lottie." No reply. Only silence, thick and unbroken. Panic struck without ceremony. She ran. The corridor stretched ahead in a blur as she checked each adjoining room. Linen cupboards, storage closets, the narrow day room with its long-locked piano. She flung open doors, her skirt catching on doorknobs, her breathing fast and shallow. No small feet, no whispers, no sign of movement. The nursery had been safe, contained, familiar. The world beyond its walls was something else entirely. She turned down the servants' passage, taking the steps 2 at a time, gripping the rail as the sharp scent of damp stone hit her lungs. The rear gardens, the only place they could go. It was the only place that might offer something resembling freedom. As she passed through the back vestibule, her boots hit the flagstones with hard, echoing steps. The wide oak door groaned open under her hand, and the outside air washed over her, sharp with the scent of grass, dusk, and distant hearth smoke. The gardens were still. Paths wound like ribbons between hedgerows and crumbling statuary, their edges blurred in the fading light. The sun had begun to fall behind the hills, casting everything in hues of steel, blue, and silver. She turned her head in every direction, willing the outline of a child to break through the soft fog that lingered at the base of the rose beds. Then she saw it. Beyond the fountain, at the edge of the cedar grove, a shape, a dark mass beneath the lowest branches of the largest cedar tree, its limbs like arms spread wide in an ancient embrace. Clara stepped off the path and began to walk. The damp grass clung to her hem. Her breath came faster, every nerve alive beneath her skin. Her boots slipped slightly in the soft earth, but she didn't slow her pace. As she drew nearer, the shape became clearer. Fabric spread across the ground, a soft giggle threading through the air. Anna. The laugh came again, unmistakable and pure. Relief struck with such force that Clara's knees nearly gave beneath her. Under the vast arms of the cedar tree, the children sat nestled together on a faded quilt. Jam tarts rested on a plate between them, their fingers sticky and sweet. Open across Lottie's knees lay the very book Clara had read from the night before, its spine creased, pages fluttering in the breeze. Lottie looked up first, a smear of jam near her chin. Her eyes met Clara's, wide but not fearful. "Miss Clara," she said softly, almost as if greeting her at the breakfast table. Anna giggled again and scooted back into the crook of Thomas's arm. Clara could not speak. The force of her relief was too much all at once. Her throat tightened, her heart thudded, and for a moment she could only kneel beside them and place a hand on the quilt to steady herself. Thomas met her gaze with something bordering on defensiveness. His spine straightened, his chin lifted, though his voice remained quiet. "We didn't run," he said. "We just wanted to be out. Just for a little while." Clara said nothing. Her fingers curled into the edge of the fabric, warm from the children's bodies and the last light of day. She looked at the open book, at the crumbs clinging to Lottie's sleeve, at the way Anna's braid had come loose and curled against her cheek. The air was changing, and not just with the coming of evening. It had taken weeks to coax them from silence, but now, without permission, without prompting, they had crossed the threshold she had so gently kept intact. They had ventured into the world beyond their room, past the heavy doors and dark corners, past the walls that had held their sorrow. They had chosen sunlight. It was a beginning. She sat with them for several minutes without speaking. Watched Thomas turn the pages of the book with quiet precision. Watched Lottie lick her fingers and press a crumb against her tongue. Watched Anna lean into her brother's shoulder and close her eyes. Safe. The ache in Clara's chest spread like heat, tender and unexpected. She had not felt it in years. When the sun dipped fully behind the hills, she reached out to touch Thomas's arm. "Come now," she said gently. "It's growing cold." He didn't protest. None of them did. Lottie held the doll to her chest and stood first, her hand curling instinctively around Clara's skirt. They walked slowly across the garden, the path now gilded faintly by the lanterns that lined the edge of the house. Clara held Anna's hand. Thomas walked a step behind, silent but present. As they neared the stone steps leading to the terrace, Clara looked up and froze. Count Edward Wexley stood there, unmoving, his hands tucked into the pockets of his overcoat. The wind stirred the edge of his collar. His expression was unreadable, carved from something harder than stone. Their eyes met. He did not call out, he did not speak, but he saw everything. Clara kept walking, her hand firm around Anna's. She didn't look back until they were inside. That night, after supper, she helped the children change into their night clothes. They seemed softer somehow. Not sleepy, but quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. She folded their blankets as they settled beneath them, whispering no good nights but offering a soft smile before dimming the candle and retreating. In her own room, the fire had burned low. She crossed to the hearth and stirred the coals, then gathered the scattered toys and laundry left over from the day. Her thoughts moved like water, slow, inevitable, pulled by something larger than herself. They were ready for more, ready for the garden, the sky, the world beyond the nursery. But were the others ready for them? She had just turned down the bed when she noticed the paper on the floor. It lay just inside the door, stark against the wooden planks. Her name was written across the front in a hand precise and unmistakable. She bent to pick it up. The envelope was thick, the wax seal unbroken. Pressed into the dark red wax was the Wexley family crest. She opened it. Inside, the message was brief. "Count Edward Wexley requests your presence in his private study at once." The corridor was quiet as Clara moved through it, the candle in her hand casting a warm flicker along the paneled walls. Night had settled heavily over Greystone, and the house had the feel of something holding its breath. Behind each door was the soft hum of a fire or the creak of settling beams, but the halls themselves had emptied into silence. Only the echo of her own steps accompanied her, muffled by the carpet beneath her boots. She reached the Count's study just after nightfall, as the note had requested. Her knuckles hovered briefly over the door before she knocked. A pause followed, long enough for her breath to hitch. But then came the low reply, "Come in." The door opened to warmth. The study was lit by firelight that danced along the walls, catching the gold embossing on leather-bound volumes and the brass edges of the map that hung behind the desk. The scent of tobacco lingered in the air, faint and pleasant, mingling with the richer aroma of old leather and the crisp bite of rain that drifted in from the open window. Count Edward Wexley stood near the hearth, his shirt sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal the sharp lines of his forearms. He wore no coat, only his waistcoat and a dark cravat slightly loosened at the neck. His hair had gone slightly damp near the temples, as though he'd stood too long in the mist. On the table beside him were scattered papers, a quill left askew, and a single tumbler of untouched brandy. He did not greet her. "I understand the children were found in the garden," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Yes," Clara replied carefully. "They were reading beneath the cedar tree." He turned then, slowly, and looked at her. Not with disapproval, but with a calm that was difficult to read. "They went of their own accord," he said. "You didn't take them." "No," she confirmed. "I hadn't even reached the nursery before I realized they were gone." He nodded once. Then this was their first act of freedom. Her hands remained still at her sides, though she felt the tension coil just beneath her skin. She was prepared for censure, perhaps even dismissal. She had broken rules again, even if unintentionally, but that was not what came. I've had time to consider your position, Edward continued. Your actions have been unorthodox, and yet undeniably effective. They speak now. They seek out light. I've not seen them do either in 3 years. He stepped away from the hearth and crossed to the desk, resting one hand on the back of the chair but not sitting. For that reason, I've decided to formally extend your engagement, not as a temporary nurse, but as permanent governess of the nursery wing. Clara blinked. The words came so plainly, with so little ceremony, that they took a moment to settle. You're offering me a permanent position? She asked. Yes. He watched her carefully, as if measuring every flicker of surprise in her eyes. With full authority over the children's schedule, instruction, and welfare, you'll be given access to the wing and resources to accommodate whatever changes you see fit. Clara hesitated, searching his expression for any sign of irony, any hidden edge. She found none. I don't understand, she said softly. You know I'm not trained for this. I've no references. I've had references before, he said. None of them lasted the day. She stared at him, unable to disguise her bewilderment. Why me? His eyes flickered, and for the first time, something shifted in his stance. A slight tension in his jaw, the faintest breath drawn too deeply. Because they trust you, he said, and because I believe they're better with you than without. Clara stood still, the fire warming her back, but not touching the chill that crept up from her feet. The offer was more than she had expected, more than she had imagined. And yet, there was something in his voice, something behind the formality, a hesitation that suggested emotion held tightly in check. You understand this won't be easy, Edward added after a pause. Certain members of the staff are less accepting of your methods. Your presence has disrupted long-standing order. If you stay, you'll need to withstand that. He met her gaze then, fully. And in that look she saw not only command, but something else, something uncertain, nearly vulnerable, an offering perhaps, or an unspoken plea. Clara's throat felt tight. I can endure opposition, she said finally. I just want what's best for them. Edward gave a slight nod. So do I. The silence between them deepened, not strained, but laden with something unsaid. Then the moment fractured. A brisk knock snapped through the quiet. Lady Rowanhurst entered without waiting for permission, as was her custom. Her eyes took in Clara with the faintest narrowing before she turned to the Count. My lord, she said, Mr. Julian Wexley is waiting in the drawing room. He has requested a word with you. The announcement hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell. Clara felt something shift in Edward's expression, a subtle darkening, as if the shadows in the room had gathered more tightly around his shoulders. Did he give a reason? Edward asked. No, my lord, but I believe he's heard of today's developments. Clara stepped back slightly. I should go. Edward didn't stop her. She moved toward the door with measured calm, though her heart felt tight in her chest. Lady Rowanhurst stood aside, letting her pass without a word. In the hallway beyond, the sconces glowed faintly, their flames flickering in the draught. Clara descended the stairs with quiet steps, the soft rustle of her skirts the only sound. She reached the corridor just as Julian turned the corner. He saw her immediately and stopped, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Hartwell, he said smoothly. A pleasure, as always. She inclined her head, not trusting her voice. He smiled, slow and deliberate. And this time, there was no politeness in it, only something cold. He stepped aside to let her pass, his gaze lingering far longer than courtesy allowed. Clara walked on, her spine straight, her hands clenched within her sleeves. She reached her room a few minutes later. The door was shut, as she had left it. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air was different, moved. Her trunk stood at the foot of the bed, unlocked, its lid gaping open. Her dresses had been shifted, her shawl unfolded. The drawer beside her wash basin half open. She crossed the room quickly and knelt beside the trunk. Her hands moved over her things, searching, checking. And then she knew. The miniature portrait, small, oval, set in tarnished silver, was gone. Clara tore through the trunk with trembling fingers, upending folded linen and pulling garments aside one by one, her movements methodical at first, then increasingly frantic. She lifted her second-best shawl, shook out the hem of her walking dress, checked beneath the flattened soles of her spare boots. But the small black velvet pouch was not where she had placed it, nested beneath the false lining of the trunk, protected from sunlight, memory, and accident. Gone. She sat back on her heels, her breath shallow and uneven. The pouch had held only one thing, a miniature portrait of her late husband, painted shortly after their wedding, the soft edge of his smile forever captured in a frame no larger than her palm. She had not touched it in months, had not dared. It was the kind of grief that aged without fading, that demanded quiet corners and deliberate forgetfulness. She had never once displayed it, never mentioned it aloud, and now it was missing. Someone had opened her trunk, gone beneath layers of clothing and pressed fabric, and taken what no one should have known existed. The violation wasn't just of her belongings, it was of her past, of her silence, of the small, buried part of her she had never offered to Greystone. The cold inside her deepened, curling under her ribs. She stood slowly, smoothed her skirts, and crossed the room to the door. Her hand hovered over the latch. Then she opened it and stepped into the corridor, her steps silent but firm as she made her way toward the housekeeper's quarters. Lady Rowanhurst answered Clara's knock with a look of restrained irritation. "Forgive the hour," Clara said, "but something is missing from my room." Lady Rowanhurst raised one arched brow. Missing? A personal item, one of sentimental value. What sort of item? Clara hesitated. A miniature portrait. It was kept in my trunk. The trunk was open when I returned tonight. The housekeeper's expression did not change. "And you're certain you didn't misplace it?" "I am." Lady Rowanhurst folded her arms. "It's not uncommon for things to shift during unpacking, or to be left tucked in drawers or coat pockets. I would suggest a more thorough search before raising suspicions." "I've already searched," Clara said quietly. "It's not there. Perhaps one of the maids moved it while airing your linens. I'll speak to them." But Clara could hear it in her tone, that edge of dismissal, too smooth, too swift. "I'd like the matter looked into," she said. Lady Rowanhurst gave a small, courteous nod. "Of course." Clara thanked her, stepped back into the corridor, and returned to her room without another word. But her heart did not settle. She no longer doubted that the disappearance had been deliberate. Someone had gone looking for that portrait, not stumbled upon it by accident. And if they had found it, what else might they uncover? Morning came with a slate-colored sky and a wind that whistled through the old window panes. In the nursery, the children were restless again. Lottie cried when her doll's ribbon could not be retied to her satisfaction. Anna refused her porridge. And Thomas sat by the window in moody silence, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes flicking toward the door every time footsteps passed in the corridor beyond. Something had reached them. Some disturbance they couldn't name but felt in the air like a storm's approach. Clara knelt beside Thomas and touched his sleeve lightly. "Would you like to go outside today?" He shrugged but didn't answer. Clara offered a small smile. "The apples are almost ripe. If we wait much longer, the birds will beat us to them." That earned a flicker of response, a shift of his brow, a nearly imperceptible lift in his shoulders. He rose, brushing past his sisters, and Clara took it as agreement. They donned their boots and shawls, and she led them down the servants' stairs, avoiding the main halls. The orchard lay at the rear of the estate, just past the greenhouse and stables, bordered by a low stone wall that had begun to crumble with age. The trees were crooked and gnarled, their branches heavy with green-gold fruit. Dew still clung to the leaves. They wandered among the trees in slow, quiet circles. Clara pointed out the dark nests tucked in branches, the early color change in the leaves. She bent to pick up a windfall apple and handed it to Lottie, who carried it like treasure. Then, as they reached the far end of the orchard, she saw him. Edward. He stood near the boundary wall, his coat unfastened, his hands in his pockets. His hair was wind-stirred and a light beard shadowed his jaw, as though he had forgotten to shave. He met her gaze, then looked down at the children. A faint tension softened around his eyes. "Morning," Clara said. He gave a nod, then fell into step beside them without invitation. Anna took Clara's hand again. Lottie moved to the opposite side of the Count, glancing up at him once before resuming her quiet apple chewing. Thomas remained near the back, watching his cousin with wary silence. They walked like that for some time, Clara speaking now and then about the branches or the bird song. Edward said little, but the children didn't flinch from his presence, and that alone was remarkable. She could feel them noticing him, and him noticing them. A stillness settled over them, not the tense kind that filled the halls of Greystone, but the kind born from something taking shape, slowly, tentatively, beneath the surface. But from across the lawn, beneath the cover of the balustrade, another figure watched. Julian. He stood at a distance, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp with calculation. And though Clara did not point him out, she saw the flick of his gaze, felt the weight of it. The children's laughter would be ammunition. That evening, after the sun had set and the nursery had gone quiet again, Julian found his way to the library. He entered with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving where he pleased, and he found Edward seated at the far end, a stack of correspondence at his elbow. "Cousin," Julian said smoothly. "May I?" Edward didn't look up. "You already have." Julian smiled and leaned one hand on the edge of the desk. "I wanted to speak plainly about Mrs. Hartwell." Edward glanced at him, expression flat. "She's charming," Julian continued. "Remarkably composed for someone of such undefined origins." Edward said nothing. Julian lowered his voice just enough to invite curiosity. "There are whispers, you know, that she never speaks of her family, that she wears no mourning ring, that perhaps her past isn't what she claims." Edward turned a page, but did not respond. "I don't say this to undermine her," Julian added with mock innocence. "Only to remind you that your household is always listening, and the idea of your children being influenced by someone with uncertain motives, well, it could raise questions you might rather avoid." Still, Edward said nothing. Julian straightened. "Of course, you'll decide what's best. You always do." He left the room with the same smile he had entered, but his words remained, lodged like thorns in the quiet. The next morning, Clara was summoned to the housekeeper's office. Lady Rowanhurst did not look up from her writing. "You are to produce your references and personal documentation by the end of the week," she said. "The Count requires it for his records." Clara stood still. "I gave what I had upon arrival. We will need additional proof. A marriage certificate, for instance." Clara's breath caught. "I understand you keep one," Lady Rowanhurst said. "Please have it ready." Clara nodded once and turned away. She returned to her room, her steps leaden, and crossed to the small writing box she kept in the drawer beneath her bedside table. She retrieved the iron key from the pouch sewn into her stays and fitted into the lock. The lid opened with a familiar creak. Inside, the compartments were as she had left them. Letters. Folded pages of scripture. The pressed flower from her wedding day faded to pale brown, but the envelope that had once held the marriage certificate was no longer there. She reached again, checking every slot, every crease, every hidden panel. It was gone. The space where the certificate had been felt colder than the rest of the box. Clara stared at the empty slot, her fingertips pressed against the velvet lining, as though the document might still be hiding beneath it, folded deeper than she remembered. But there was nothing. No envelope, no parchment, no trace of what had once offered the only formal proof of who she was and who she had loved. She closed the lid slowly, not because she had given up hope, but because the realization had settled too deeply in her chest for anything else. Someone had gone through her things with purpose. They hadn't taken money, or clothes, or anything of visible value. No, they had taken the one item that held her past, and now, her credibility. The portrait, the certificate, both gone. The chill of it reached her bones. She sat still for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway, of a door closing somewhere on the upper floor. Her thoughts moved slowly, not out of confusion, but out of something heavier, dread. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. Someone was erasing her, piece by piece, in ways that could not be easily traced or replaced. Without proof, without a document bearing her name and the record of her marriage, she became simply Clara Hartwell. A woman with no past, a stranger among strangers. When she brought the matter to Lady Rowanhurst that morning, the housekeeper listened with her usual impassive air, her mouth pursed and eyes steady. "Are you certain it was kept in the box?" she asked. Clara nodded once. "And you've no other copy?" "No, that was the only one." Lady Rowanhurst's quill scratched faintly over the paper in front of her. She set it aside and folded her hands. "Then I'm afraid there's little to be done, Mrs. Hartwell. I would advise checking once more, and perhaps you might recall where else it could have been placed. In the meantime, the Count's request remains unchanged." Clara said nothing. She did not accuse, she did not plead. But her silence, once a sanctuary, had begun to feel like something sharp against her tongue. Back in the nursery, the children waited. She moved through the day as she always had, gathering breakfast, opening the drapes, reading aloud. But the lightness was gone. She felt it in her limbs, in the weight of her own voice as she told a story she barely heard herself saying. The children noticed. Anna clung to her hand longer than usual. Lottie wandered aimlessly and refused to eat the jam tarts she'd begged for the day before. And Thomas, sharp-eyed and silent, watched her too closely, as if trying to measure a danger he couldn't name. By late morning, Lottie asked the question Clara had dreaded. "Are you going to leave?" The words were small and trembling, her doll pressed tightly to her chest. Clara knelt beside her, tucking a strand of hair behind the child's ear. "No," she said, gently, but not firmly enough. Lottie looked down. The others left. "I'm not like the others." But her heart betrayed her. The truth was, she didn't know how much longer she would be allowed to stay. Elsewhere in the house, the mood had shifted. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Servants who once greeted her with cautious politeness now offered only brief nods, their eyes slipping past her as though she'd become translucent. The house, once only cold in temperature, had grown cold in spirit. Edward noticed. He noticed the hush that fell in the hallway as Clara passed. He noticed the way Anna's shoulders hunched when Clara's name was spoken. He noticed the return of the children's nervous glances, the old stiffness creeping back into Thomas's posture. And he noticed Julian, always too near, too watchful, too ready. It was in the late afternoon, just outside the library, that Edward confronted him. Julian stood before the window, his coat immaculate, his hair carefully parted, the very image of idle elegance. "You've been busy," Edward said, voice low but without pretense. Julian turned slowly, smiling as if the conversation had already amused him. "I merely observe," he said, "and when something appears amiss, I act in the family's interest." Edward's expression darkened. "You imply that Clara Hartwell is, what, a threat?" Julian's eyes gleamed. "Not a threat, no, but a mystery, certainly. One we cannot afford to overlook." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a small velvet pouch, and placed it lightly on the table beside him. Edward recognized it immediately. "I found it near the servants' stairwell," Julian said, his voice casually laced with innocence. "Perhaps it fell, or was hidden. Either way, it seems personal. You'll want to return it, of course." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. Edward did not touch the pouch, nor did he question how Julian had come to be in that particular hallway. His silence was not agreement, but it allowed Julian to step back, to turn and leave the room with the ease of someone confident in the damage left behind. That evening, the conservatory was still warm from the afternoon sun. The last of the rose blooms lingered on their stems, pale and wilting, their scent clinging to the air like perfume from another time. The glass panes had fogged with the coming night, and lanterns had been lit to cast a low golden glow across the tiled floor. Clara stepped into the room, summoned again, uncertain of what awaited her. Edward stood at the far end, near the white-painted trellis where vines curled upward in neat, trained spirals. He turned as she entered. His expression was unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said. She inclined her head. "You wish to speak with me?" "Yes." He paused, then folded his hands behind his back. "I need to ask you something, and I'd rather you not mistake the reason for the question." Clara's hands remained at her sides, fingers gently curled. He took a step closer, the scent of roses stronger now, mixed with the faint smell of damp soil. "Did you come to Greystone under false pretenses?" he asked. The words, though softly spoken, struck her like the sudden snap of frost. Her breath stilled. "I've been told your past is unclear, that your grief may not be as it seems." She didn't move. She didn't blink. "You mean to ask," she said, "if I'm lying?" Edward said nothing. But the silence was an answer in itself. Clara's gaze didn't falter. "I have lost things I cannot replace. I came here with the truth I was allowed to keep. If that's not sufficient." "I didn't say it wasn't," he said quietly. "But you asked." The betrayal in her voice wasn't sharp. It was quiet, worn. The sound of something fragile beginning to break. "I thought you saw me," she said. "I do." She stepped back, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "Then you'll understand why I won't explain myself further. I'll leave by week's end." She turned to go, her hand reaching for the door handle. But from the corridor beyond came a sudden cry, high and urgent. "Miss Clara!" It was Anna, her voice trembling. Something was wrong. Clara didn't pause. Anna's frightened cry had barely left the air before she was moving, her skirts brushing against the tiled floor of the conservatory as she crossed the threshold into the hallway. The urgency in the girl's voice struck her deeper than any accusation could have. She ran without thinking, guided by instinct and dread, her boots silent on the carpet runner as she turned toward the servants' staircase that led down to the gardens. She found them in the narrow lawn between the orchard wall and the lower rose beds. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the stone. Lottie stood at the edge of the path, wide-eyed and motionless. Anna was kneeling beside Thomas, who lay on the ground clutching his arm, his face pale and set in a tight grimace of pain. His back was against the base of the old brick wall that lined the orchard, one foot still tangled in the trailing vine he'd likely used to climb. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already reaching. "Thomas," she said gently, pushing back the hair from his forehead. "Can you hear me?" He nodded once, jaw clenched. "What happened?" she asked, already assessing the angle of his arm, the way his shoulder had shifted awkwardly beneath his jacket. "I wanted to see the rook's nest," he muttered, voice taut with pain. "It was just for a second." "It's all right," she said. "You're going to be all right. I need to check your arm. This will hurt, but only for a moment." The boy didn't speak again, but he didn't resist. His trust in her was immediate, unspoken. Clara moved with calm precision, loosening his sleeve, pressing gently around the joint. The bone didn't appear broken, but it was clearly dislocated. Shoulder or elbow, she couldn't yet tell. His fingers still moved. That was something. She cradled his forearm and looked to Anna, who hovered anxiously nearby. "I need my shawl, the one from the bench," Clara said. "Quickly." Anna nodded and ran. Servants had begun to gather, their faces pale with uncertainty, but none of them stepped forward. They looked between one another, waiting for instruction, unsure whether to interfere. Clara ignored them. When Anna returned, Clara fashioned the shawl into a makeshift sling, wrapping it beneath Thomas's elbow and tying it behind his neck. Her movements were firm but steady. She spoke to him all the while, her voice a low murmur of comfort that kept his eyes on her, not the pain. Only once did she glance up, and there, standing at the top of the path near the terrace, was Edward. He didn't speak. He simply watched, his hands at his sides, his shoulders tense beneath the dark fabric of his coat. Clara could feel the weight of his gaze. Not judgmental, but transfixed. She smoothed the hair back from Thomas's brow and pressed a kiss to the crown of his head before rising slowly to her feet. She called for 2 of the footmen to help lift him, her voice crisp and clear. "Be gentle, support his back. We'll carry him to the nursery." They obeyed without question. Edward stepped aside as they passed. Clara didn't meet his eyes, but the silence between them rang with something new. Upstairs, she directed the children's maid to fetch clean linens and warm water. She sat with Thomas, held his uninjured hand as he bit back tears, and promised him that he'd be well enough to finish the story they'd begun yesterday. Lottie curled in the corner, eyes shining with unshed tears, while Anna fetched every blanket in the nursery and layered them one by one at her brother's feet. When the doctor arrived, summoned quickly by Edward's man, he confirmed what Clara had suspected. The shoulder had been partially dislocated. Painful, but manageable. Clara's calm handling had prevented it from worsening. "She's done better than half the nurses I've worked with," the man said to no one in particular. After Thomas had been dosed with laudanum and settled to rest, Clara sat in her chamber, hands motionless in her lap. She had not wept. She had not broken. But she began to pack. One by one, she folded her dresses, gathered her few books. She opened the small drawer beside the hearth and touched the space where her writing box had sat, the spot where her name had once been clear and sure on a marriage certificate that now existed only in memory. She didn't know where she would go next, only that she could not remain in a place that didn't believe her. She had nearly finished folding her second shawl when the knock came. She didn't answer. She wasn't ready. But the door opened anyway. Edward stood in the frame, the light from the hallway behind him. He looked exhausted, and not from duty or sleeplessness, but from something deeper. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded envelope. "I believe these are yours." He placed them on the table beside her trunk. Clara rose slowly. Her eyes moved to the envelope, then to his face. Edward's voice was quiet, but steady. They were found in the back of Julian's writing desk, locked in a box with documents of no importance, the portrait too. Her hands trembled. She reached for the envelope but did not open it. "I didn't know what he was doing," Edward continued, "but I should have. I let my doubts speak louder than the proof in front of me." Clara's throat ached. "He's gone," Edward said, dismissed quietly. "He won't return to Greystone." She didn't speak. "I was wrong," he said, "and I'm sorry." His apology landed between them like something precious and fragile, not loud, not dramatic, but real. She looked up at him then, truly looked. The hardness in his face had cracked, giving way to something softer, something honest. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the children need you, though they do, and not because the house feels different when you're here, though it does." He took a slow breath. "I want you to stay because I can't remember what it was like before you came. And I don't want to." Clara said nothing, but she reached for his hand. Not as a servant, not as someone who owed him anything, but as a woman who had been seen and chosen, not despite her wounds, but because of them. In the days that followed, Greystone began to change again, subtly at first. The servants no longer whispered when Clara passed them in the corridors. Lady Rowanhurst, still formal, no longer met her with clipped words but with careful respect. The windows of the nursery remained open, even when rain threatened, and the sound of laughter began to rise once more from the north wing. Clara resumed her duties with quiet grace. She moved through the house as though she belonged there, not by permission, but by right. The children flourished. Thomas regained the color in his cheeks. His shoulder healed, and he resumed his quiet questions, his thoughtful silences. Anna grew bold again, her drawings now filled with color and sunlight, and the faces of people she loved. Lottie laughed, unafraid and unguarded, brushing Clara's sleeve with her doll's hand each morning, no longer to ask if she was real, but just to be near. Edward joined them in the gardens, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a story of his own. The children no longer stepped aside when he approached. They drew him in. The orchard bloomed. The roses returned. And one morning, as Clara crossed the east courtyard with the sun on her back, she passed a tall window and caught her reflection, not alone, but shadowed by 3 small figures behind her. She smiled and walked on. Spring settled over Westmoreland like a warm breath after a long-held silence. The cold rains of winter gave way to morning mists that clung gently to the grass before lifting into pale blue skies. Greystone Hall, once sunk deep into shadows and silence, began to stretch beneath the sun's touch, its ivy-covered walls softening, its gardens rousing from dormancy. Crocuses emerged first, then daffodils, their bright faces nodding near the stone paths where no child had run in years. Birds returned to the hedgerows, sparrows, finches, a pair of bold thrushes who nested near the east wing. Clara, with sleeves rolled to her elbows and dirt beneath her nails, dug beside the children in the small plot she'd claimed near the southern wall. It had once been Eleanor's garden, neglected and overgrown, bordered by a crumbling low wall and forgotten tools, but Clara had cleared it, coaxed it back into care. They planted roses, deep pink ones, like those that had once filled Eleanor's vases in the drawing room, and soft white blooms that Clara chose for reasons she couldn't name, only feel. Lottie, wearing her bonnet askew, carried the watering can like a holy vessel. Anna placed the roots with delicate fingers and whispered to them as she did. Thomas, more reserved, dug the holes with precise care and adjusted the angle of each plant until it was straight. No one rushed. No one scolded. Edward came each morning. He no longer watched from a distance. Instead, he joined them with a spare coat over his shirt sleeves, walking the garden paths with quiet ease. Sometimes he brought a basket of seed packets, sometimes nothing at all. He stood near Clara, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed, and spoke with the children in a voice that had lost its practiced distance. They spoke of robins and early bloom, of soil quality and pruning shears. They didn't speak of grief, or of endings. That chapter, while not erased, had turned. Clara felt it in the way the air no longer pressed against her chest, in the way the halls of Greystone filled, quietly but surely, with sound, not of footsteps in dread, but of children's voices rising and falling like birdsong. The nursery, once entombed in silence and dust, had become a sanctuary again. Its windows stood open. The heavy drapes had been removed and replaced with simple linen ones that billowed with the breeze. Toys lay strewn across the floor, not from neglect but from play. Books waited on shelves, pages dog-eared with affection. Thomas kept a small carved fox on the windowsill. Anna's drawings covered one wall. Lottie had decided the carpet was for picnics, and Clara had not argued. Each evening they sat together with stories or songs, sometimes only the hush of wind against stone. It wasn't joy in the loud, irrepressible sense. It was gentler, truer. Clara never asked for acknowledgement, but she noticed how the servants had changed. The glances that once skirted her were now direct and respectful. The footman no longer paused before opening doors for her. The cook offered her baskets of herbs unasked. And Lady Rowanhurst, though she still spoke with the clipped diction of someone raised to believe in hierarchies and roles, had begun to consult Clara on household matters. "Mrs. Hartwell," she had said one morning, glancing over her spectacles, "the Count prefers blackberry preserves with the game fowl. I believe you'll find them in the larder." Clara had blinked. The request was small, domestic, but it was the first time she'd been treated as a woman of influence within the house, not merely tolerated on the edge of its rooms. It was not lost on her, and it was not lost on Edward, who, in his quiet way, ensured her integration without command or fanfare. He consulted her on the children's routines. He deferred to her insight in matters of their care, and more than once she had caught the way his eyes followed her when she left a room, as though he wanted to remember the shape she made in the space she now occupied. Their connection had taken root the way things did when left undisturbed, slowly, deeply. There were no grand confessions, no florid declarations by moonlight. Instead, there were shared glances across the garden beds. The way Edward's fingers brushed hers when she handed him pruning shears. The way she reached for his sleeve when Thomas asked a question neither of them could quite answer. The way their footsteps matched without effort as they walked the edge of the orchard one morning, speaking only of the way frost kissed the early leaves. The household had come to accept it long before either of them had named it. One evening, with the sun setting in a pale orange blaze, the drawing room filled with the warmth of firelight. The children were upstairs, half asleep, their limbs tangled beneath quilts and storybooks. Clara sat near the hearth, one hand curled around a cup of tea gone cold. Edward stood nearby, sorting through a stack of correspondence he hadn't yet opened. The fire snapped softly between them. He moved to sit beside her, not stiffly, not with ceremony, but as though it was the only place he belonged. His hand found hers. She didn't startle. She didn't even look down. She simply allowed his fingers to intertwine with hers, the way ivy slips along a wall it has known for years. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that had not already been lived. The firelight played across the edge of the room, casting long golden shadows against the rug, the bookshelves, the carved frame of the chair where Clara sat. Outside, the wind rustled through the ivy, but the room remained warm. For a moment, Edward leaned closer, just enough to press his temple to hers. Still, no words, but it was enough. And when Clara rose to fetch her shawl, when she passed through the corridor toward the nursery, she paused outside the door that had once been closed for 3 long years. It stood open now. The hinges had been oiled, the wood polished. Sunlight streamed in even at dusk, casting a soft glow across the floor, where Lottie's doll lay nestled in a blanket, left behind in the rush of sleep. Clara stepped inside, not as a caretaker, but as someone who belonged. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. What did you think of the story? Which moment touched your heart the most? Or which character did you connect with deeply? I'd love to hear your thoughts, truly. Reading your comments is one of the best parts of sharing these stories, and it helps this channel reach even more people who love emotional, romantic journeys like this one. So please leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you after the final page. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.